Welcome back to our next session of our study on Leviticus. We just talked about the Day of Atonement, which is a turning point in the book of Leviticus because we're dealing with this strange problem of God's presence. And it's strange that it's a problem because God's presence is wonderful. Indeed it is, but it's also dangerous because he's a holy God and we are an unholy people. What makes matters worse, we are an unclean people. What makes matters even worse, we are a sinful people. And so there's this constant sense in which we have to be careful around God because we may violate his perfection. We may find ourselves in danger, and he gives us the Day of Atonement. He gives us the Day of Atonement so that we might be drawn back into fellowship with him in a way that doesn't remove our reverence, but it does increase our confidence that we're welcome here. And so there is a little bit of a crescendo as you work your way toward Leviticus 16, and it is kind of a hinge that sits in the very middle of the book. And then from there, we're actually going to transition our attention to quite a few different laws and regulations about various things. But it feels like chapter 17 is almost a little bit of an interlude, to be real with you. As I've read this in the past, I've thought, man, I don't really know what 17's doing in there, but we're going to unpack it together today. Leviticus chapter 17, and we're going to see that I think what we find here is a call to watch our worship, to pay close attention to how we're offering our devotion to the Lord. So it is a relatively short chapter. I'd like to read the whole thing, and then we'll break it down in a few different ways. Leviticus 17. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all Israelites, and say to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Any Israelite who sacrifices an ox, a lamb, or a goat in the camp or outside of it, instead of bringing it to the entrance to the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord in front of the tabernacle of the Lord, that person shall be considered guilty of bloodshed. They have shed blood and must be cut off from their people." We'll make sure we're following along. He's saying if you offer any Israelite who offers a sacrifice somewhere else, somewhere other than here in front of the tabernacle where God has appointed this place as the sacrifice place, then you will be considered as a murderer and it will not be acceptable as a sacrifice. Verse 5 says, "This is so the Israelites will bring to the Lord the sacrifices they are now making in the open fields. They must bring them to the priest, that is, to the Lord, at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and sacrifice them as fellowship offerings. The priest is to splash the blood against the altar of the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and burn the fat as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. They must no longer offer any of their sacrifices to the goat idols to whom they prostitute themselves. This is to be a lasting ordinance for them and for the generations to come. Say to them, any Israelite or any foreigner residing among them who offers a burnt offering or sacrifice and does not bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting to sacrifice it to the Lord must be cut off from the people of Israel. I will set my face against any Israelite or any foreigner residing among them who eats blood, and I will cut them off from my people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. Therefore I say to the Israelites, none of you may eat blood, nor may any foreigner residing among you eat blood." May have been a bit of a surprise because I thought we were talking about sacrifices. We were. And then we talked about how this rule about sacrifices applies to the Israelites as well as to foreigners living among them. And then as he's talking about Israelites and the foreigners among them, he switches his attention to now regulations concerning blood. You're not allowed to do certain things with it. Eat it, drink it. Let me finish the text. It says, any Israelite or any foreigner residing among you who hunts any animal or bird that may be eaten must drain out the blood and cover it with earth, because the life of every creature is its blood. That is why I have said to the Israelites, you must not eat the blood of any creature, because the life of every creature is its blood. Anyone who eats it must be cut off. Anyone, whether native born or foreigner, who eats anything found dead or torn by wild animals must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be ceremonially unclean until evening. Then they will be clean. But if they do not wash their clothes and bathe themselves, they will be held responsible. This is a bit of I keep saying this with Leviticus, odd text. And so let's see if we can't make it seem a bit less odd to us, or at least understand the nature of the oddness. What we're dealing with, as you can see, is restrictions. There are certain things that God's people and the foreigners living among them are simply not supposed to do. And you've got two themes here. The first theme of restrictions is about sacrifices. Which ones are acceptable and which ones are not? And within this, you could actually break it down in a couple of different ways. You've got the question of location, and then you've got the leaders. So I think we probably have a sense of what it said, but just to make sure, there were Israelites who were offering, this is the fellowship offering. So this is sort of the one that's a little bit looser. You can offer it when you want. It's not about atonement. It really is an expression of your thankfulness to God or your friendship with God or your appreciation. And it seems like what was happening is that the Israelites were getting a little bit too loose with this simply because you could do it any time. Doesn't mean you can do it any place. No. You can't offer your sacrifices out there in the fields. You got to bring them here to the tabernacle, to the tent of meeting, to the place that God has appointed. And also there's a specific mention, not just about the location, but about the leaders. You have to bring it to the appointed leaders. I mean, the language could not be stronger identifying the leaders with Yahweh. Bring it to the Lord, that is to the priests, or to the priest, that is to the Lord. Now, I just want to pause from working through the text and acknowledge that if this doesn't sit well with you, if this seems a little odd to you, welcome to the club. This is something that seems a bit strange to our modern ears, and not necessarily for bad reason. And the way I see it, when you look at these restrictions for acceptable sacrifices and to recognize that the people who wrote this, the priestly community, Moses, are saying that you have to only do sacrifices here with us. And they're saying you only do them here with us because God has laid it out this way. Now, there's a couple of fundamental ways in which you can read this text. You can read this text with suspicion. Or you can read this text with trust. Now, I just want to identify the categories. So reading this text with suspicion essentially would say, clearly this is a power grab. I mean, that's what it looks like. You don't need Karl Marx or neo-Marxist critical theory to identify for you that what seems to be happening here, at least what might be happening here, is that you have a group of leaders whose well-being depends on sacrifices being offered right here. You've got a group of leaders whose social power is maintained by there being only one location where you can offer the sacrifices. And so if there's a part of you that's a little bit suspicious, again, I'm not reprimanding you at all. I think it's a fairly natural thing to say, are we sure that what seems to be going on here or what is being claimed is actually what's going on here? The other option would be that you read this text with a spirit of trust, that you hear it saying, God has mediated his presence and blessing through us, and you take it as saying, God has mediated his presence and blessing through us. Now, I would never just tell you that you should just pay attention to the text without thinking it through. Now, I think that it is the inspired word of God, and so there are limitations around the type of questioning that we should provide it, but I do think it's beneficial to think things through. We're talking about authorized, centralized leadership. Is that actually what God indicates as being his will? And for me, there's actually a way to think through this. Whenever I'm thinking about whether I should be suspicious of a spiritual leader, even within Scripture, who's claiming to speak on behalf of Yahweh in a way that benefits him or benefits his group, I tend to ask two things. Number one, is there a meaningful rationale for the laws or the restrictions that are being offered? And number two, does the text manifest a willingness to criticize its own leaders? So again, is there a meaningful rationale, and is the text willing to criticize the leaders who seem to be putting themselves at the center? And in both cases, I think the answer is a fairly easy yes. There is a meaning to the rationale. There is a reason why they were saying that you need to offer your sacrifices here, and you actually find it in 17:7. It says they must no longer offer any of their sacrifices to the goat idols to whom they prostitute themselves. So what seems to have been happening is you had these various other gods, some translations of that word call them goat demons, and these people were offering their sacrifices out and about in part because they wanted to offer sacrifices to these other gods. Now, it may be that they didn't want to offer a sacrifice to Yahweh, but instead they wanted to offer a sacrifice to this god. Why would you do that? Why would you offer a sacrifice to a goat demon? Well, because you wouldn't necessarily think it was a demon. You would think that you were offering your sacrifice to this spiritual presence that was going to provide you blessing and fertility. Goats were beneficial for various things, and so they became a symbol of fertility like many other things. So it could be that people are saying, we don't want to worship Yahweh, we want to worship this other thing. Azazel is a word that is sometimes used in that regard as a translation of the term. Or it could be that, no, they're trying to worship Yahweh, they're just kind of hedging their bets a little bit, Kind of like whenever Israel worshiped a golden calf and said, this is Yahweh who brought you up out of slavery in Egypt. And so that seems to be the rationale for what's going on here. God is saying, I want you to not worship other gods. And so to make that point really clear, I'm going to institute a place where you're going to worship. I want you to not go to other gods' priests or to think that you have some sort of a mediatory presence with other spiritual beings. And so I want you to come and offer it to the leaders who I've appointed to this particular ministry. When it comes to the willingness to criticize, I think it's fairly clear from the book of Leviticus that the priests are not beyond critique. Aaron's very sons, Nadab and Abihu, already lost their lives. And if you don't know that Israel is willing to criticize her leaders, spend a bit of time in pretty much any of the Hebrew prophets, and you'll see very quickly that this is the case. So that's what we see, first of all, is the restrictions with related to sacrifices. But the second thing that we see is a restriction with related to blood. So let's look again at this and then try to figure out if there's some way in which they can come together. And once again, here you have some specific rules, and then you have a rationale that is offered for those specific rules. So the rules for blood are, if it is an animal that is appropriate for sacrifices, then you offer the blood of that animal to God as the sacrifice, but you don't drink it. Eat it, same idea. You don't drink it. On the other hand, if you are dealing with not an animal that would be appropriate for sacrifice, say in a hunt or whatever, you pour the blood out, but you don't drink it. So those are the rules, no drinking blood. And the rationale is actually present there in the text. I want you to look again at what God says. Verse 11, "For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourself on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life." And then later on, when talking about the animals that aren't good for offering, he actually makes a similar argument. The life of the creature is its blood. He says that multiple times, coming back around to the fact that blood is something that God has instituted to provide for sacrifices. And that actually is a regulation that covers even the blood of those who aren't sacrificed. So what in the world does this mean? Well, maybe it's fairly clear to you. The idea is that God has given blood for a particular purpose. The blood is the very life of the creature. You understand if the creature loses its blood, the creature dies. And so the blood is and therefore represents life. And because the sacrifices involved killing this living creature in order to atone for the sins of the one who deserves to die, this blood has a sacred purpose, represents the life given in death of the animal for the sacrificer. It is the way God has given people an opportunity to come back into his presence. So that's kind of the rationale that's behind this, is because God has given it for a specific purpose, you are not to use it for other purposes. It could, in fact, be that, the drinking or the consuming of blood had to do with idol practices of the peoples around. We don't know that for sure, but we do know that God has said, the life of the creature is its blood, and I have given you blood to make atonement. So that's what we see in this text. And it would, as always, make sense to ask the question, well, what does this mean for us? In particular, this blood piece is fairly interesting because there's a text in Acts chapter 15 that I want to note, and then, as always, encourage you to go back and read up on a little bit later. What's going on in Acts chapter 15 is that the early church is really wrestling with the question of Gentiles as part of the community of faith, as part of the church. And what's happened is it's not just that this Jewish group of Jesus followers have allowed Gentiles in, it's that they've allowed Gentiles in without those Gentiles first becoming Jews. So now they're being given covenant promises without becoming covenant children, except the gospel actually brings about the new covenant, so they are. That's the tension you can kind of see. And to make a long story short, there's some disputing by different groups, and the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, James, Jesus' brother, was the head elder there. The leaders of the church in Jerusalem, together with the people, decide that, in fact, the Gentiles don't have to submit themselves to the law of Moses in order to be saved. But they give them some regulations that they want to follow. Food sacrifice, idols, a couple other things, and they're not allowed to drink blood. The blood regulation stands. And so there we have to ask the question, is this something that is still a law for us because we're Gentiles and they were Gentiles? And I don't actually think that this is the case. I think there's a verse that actually helps us understand there in Acts where it says, the law of Moses is preached in every town that we find ourselves in up to this day. And that's telling us that in the context of a community in which Jews and Gentiles are just initially trying to figure out the rules, they're asking the Gentiles to avoid some particular practices that the Jews associate with idolatry. Some of those practices are actual moral issues that are universal. Sexual immorality was on the list. Some of those practices, I think, are more cultural, this being one of them. So that's that, but is that everything? What do we do with this? What is this text? It's probably appropriate for us to say at times we may study a text and understand it in its context and conclude that it doesn't necessarily have a whole lot directly to say to us. We don't want to stretch anything. But typically, if you look closely, you can actually see something that is, in fact, relevant for us today. So let me ask again, what is this text? First of all, in that day, I would suggest that this text is a little bit of a heart check. I would suggest that this text is a little bit of a call to watch your worship. So we've had all these regulations about clean and unclean, and then we've been given this atonement by God so that we might be safe in his presence, even though we recognize that there are probably imperfections that threaten us because he's holy and he's here. But don't take things lightly. And I think maybe in two particular ways, there are some dangers that are identified in this particular passage. One, I'm going to use the somewhat technical term of syncretism. Syncretism is a word that simply means mixing your worship. So syncretism is not the same thing as flat out idolatry. It's not, I'm going to stop worshiping the God of Israel. I'm going to stop worshiping the creator God. I'm going to worship some other God. It's more so, no, I'm going to still worship this God, but I'm going to hedge by my bets by offering some devotion to some other God and fill in the blank. And so here we see a call against syncretism. The people of Israel are called to worship God and God alone. And I think the second issue that you see here is, I don't know exactly the right word. I'm going to call it convenience. It seems like I'll put the word serious in parentheses, because it seems like what's going on is that the practice of it's just blood. Well, it's not just blood. It's blood which God has given us as the life of the creature to be offered for atonement. And so there's kind of this laissez-faire, there's some blood, and it may seem strange to us to want to drink blood, and yet if you recognize that part of what we're talking about is the eating of an unfully cooked steak, then it's actually not that strange to us. And we think in our time it's just blood, and maybe living under the new covenant, that's a perfectly fine attitude to have about blood. But at this particular period in time, when God was training them so that they might be prepared to understand the fullness of revelation that God would bring in the Messiah, to sit fast and loose to the things that God has given them, these regulations that he's laid down, is to take for granted the holiness of God and to lean into convenience, to not take with proper seriousness issues related to worship of God. And this is where it becomes fairly easy for us to apply the text to ourselves. They were called to watch their worship. We're called to the same. This passage served them as a heart check. Are you following these things in a way that is properly manifesting single-hearted worship to the Lord? These things can offer us a heart check. And so it might be beneficial for us to ask not just what about their worship, but what about our worship? What about your worship? Is your worship singular? Is your worship pure? Is our worship one in which we're worshiping the God who has revealed himself to us in the scriptures, most clearly in Jesus? Or are we falling into the trap, probably not of outright idolatry, but of God and? God and may be a perfectly fine way of saying, God is the most important thing to me, and there are other things that are important because of God. God and family, God and country, God and team, whatever it might be. Or it could be a way of saying, I'm going to worship God, but I'm also going to give a certain amount of my devotion, my heart. I'm going to give a bit too much time, energy, money to something else. You get the point. I think you can understand the word well enough to ask the Lord to show you if there are aspects of your life in which you are mixing worship of God with worship of idols. And then the second piece is one of convenience. I am so grateful for the freedom that God has provided us in Jesus to come into the throne of his presence, to come in to his place and receive his grace and find mercy and find fulfillment and find an open hand, a soft, gentle, strong voice, to be invited in. But being invited in because of Jesus, confidently, should never descend into acting like we can just sort of treat these as matters of convenience. Is your worship of God one in which you are offering him pure, singular worship, and one in which you are taking him seriously? If it is, great. If it's not, then you probably ought to read Leviticus 17 again. And either way, something that we are never allowed to stop doing is indeed to watch our worship. So we'll come back next time and talk about how what we do in our worship extends to what we do in our most intimate places. Chapter 18 is not so much about watching our worship directly as it is sanctifying our sex. It will be fun, and I will see you then. But until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace.